Hey everybody, in today's video, we're going to edit the Witch Head Nebula because this is a very popular target this time of year, and I know a lot of people are struggling to get a great shot. The photo you're looking at was captured from a Bortle 2. It's about 11 hours worth of data, and I used the SpaceCat 61mm telescope, no filter, and the ASI 2600 Air. And I know that quite a few of you do have the 2600 Air camera, and you probably experienced issues with the image corruption problem. If so, the underlying reason for that is your power supply, and based on what I've seen, the only power supply that I have that works well is the Jackery 1000 watt-hour battery. If I use any other battery, I get all the problems with the 2600 Air. Therefore, if you do have the camera and you have been having trouble, try using a different power supply or maybe an extension cord to a wall outlet and see if that works better. And don't forget to contact ZWO and see what they have to say. There is one other thing I want to mention before we get started, and that is if you're struggling with Astro over the past few months, you're not alone. I know for myself, we've had maybe 5 clear nights since November, and even when we do get a clear night, I'm making stupid mistakes that are very costly. For example, I recently photographed the Jellyfish Nebula in SHO, or at least I thought I was. It turns out I only captured H-alpha and oxygen. When I thought I was capturing sulfur, I never changed the filter in the auto run menu. And it took me 3 days to figure out what I did wrong. And it's dumb little problems like this that can really ruin your week. So take it from me, even if you've been doing Astro for a while, these mistakes can happen. And you just have to hang in there, have some patience, and try to get some sleep before those clear nights. Because if you are sleep deprived, it makes everything more difficult, especially 2 in the morning. Alright, so let's get right into it. I have the Witch Head Nebula, and because this was taken without any filters from a Bortle 2, it makes it fairly easy. I can use the default SPCC settings, and that should work fine. And it doesn't look like much right out of the gate. That's the thing, this is some fairly faint dust, so this will take a lot of work to get a nice final photo. The next step is to run BlurXterminator, because even though I was using the SpaceCat 61mm, and the stars look good, but they could always be a bit better. And if you have my deep space course, you know I like to run this first with just correct only. That will clear up any strange looking stars, especially in the corners, and then from there, we can run it a second time. And if we do it before and after, you can see that while the stars did look fairly sharp, they're much sharper now by comparison, and that's just doing the correct only. You really want to watch this though, because I do have a few students that I've worked with where it actually looked worse after running correct only, because their stars in the original photo were so sharp. So while I normally recommend running this, it doesn't mean in every single case it's a good idea. And then from here, you know, we don't really have much in the way of sharp detail in the Witch's Head. It's all kind of just diffuse dust. Although there are some really small galaxies, which you'll see in a few minutes, which look kind of cool. Here's one down here, for example. Anyway, my point with that is just to say that I don't really need to increase the sharpen on stellar very much. Probably put it around 0.7. And then for the sharpen stars and adjust star halos, I normally don't do much here at all, just a very slight amount. And if you want to get an idea of how this is going to look, don't forget about your real-time preview. You're going to have to really zoom in though, and then once you do that, you can update these values and see what looks best. And if it doesn't seem to be updating in real time, you can always click on the little toggle button in the top left to see the before and after. So I think I'm going to go with these settings here, and I'll apply that to the photo. All right, well, that was a pretty minimal change, but that's kind of the whole idea. I don't want to be too extreme whenever I'm doing that. Next up, I'm going to run StarXterminator, because these stars are only going to get in the way for the rest of our processing. And once that's complete, I'm just going to minimize the stars and get those out of the way. From back here, you can see that there is a bit of a vignette caused by the SpaceCat and the fact that I did not take flat frames. The reason I don't take flat frames, as many of you know, is just because there are a lot of work to do, especially with a monochrome camera. Not that this was a monochrome camera, but still. I'd rather just fix my gradients or vignette with dynamic background extraction. Although if you had dust spots especially, of course you will want to take flat frames to clear those up. Or better yet, just keep your sensor clean. And with dynamic background extraction, I'm assuming you all know how this works, so I'm just going to speed through this because it is kind of tedious, and then we'll reconvene when it's done. One thing I should mention while I'm doing this is that the current contrast is very flat, and that can make it difficult to see where to place your points. So in fact, before you run dynamic background extraction, what you could do is grab your screen transfer function tool and then make sure the check mark is on. And what I'll do now with this photo selected is zoom in to where my little lines are and bring them closer together. We're not really going to keep this stretch. It's just to make it easier to see where to place your points. Then again, because I have this vignette, if I add too much contrast, this just becomes clipped in the shadows and it's hard to see where to place those points. But if you took your flat frames, then you wouldn't really have that problem. Another thing I'm noticing with this current contrast is that we still have some satellite remnants, even though I use the Winsorized Sigma clipping, large scale pixel rejection, etc. I don't know why it didn't work that well this time when it has before in the past. So unfortunately, we'll have to fix this problem later in Photoshop. All right, I think that'll work for the contrast, at least for now. And then I'll go through and do the dynamic background extraction. Remember, when we're doing this, we are trying to place the points on the black background of space, because if you accidentally place this on any dust or nebulosity, it'll try to make that much darker, and things are gonna look really weird. I think that'll work. I know it could be a bit better, but let's see how it goes. For my target image correction, because we don't have any light pollution to deal with really, I'll do division, and I will normalize the final image. That's not bad. And if we take a look at the background, that's about what we saw. It's brighter there, darker there. I think that'll work. And when you're doing this on your own, of course, you just want to look over the image and make sure there's nothing unnaturally dark. If you do see some unnaturally dark areas, that would indicate that you had a point placed somewhere in the dust, and you'll want to delete that. Another thing I'd recommend doing is dragging your triangle off onto the background and calling this DBE version 1. Just so if you come back to the image next week or tomorrow, whatever, and you discover that there was a problem with dynamic background extraction, you don't have to go through and place all those points again. Because provided you're saving your PixInsight projects, you can come in here, let's say this is tomorrow, you're working on version 2, and you can just double click on DBE version 1. Everything is just the way you left it. Maybe you find that you had a point placed right here and you never saw it. You can go ahead and delete that. The next step in the workflow is to fix the noise, because even though I had about 12 hours worth of data, this is a very dim target and there is a lot of grain. Thankfully, Russ Croman recently came out with NoiseXterminator version 3.0, at least for the AI. And Adam Block did an interview with Russ Croman just today, actually, where he goes through and explains all the new features and shows how he personally uses the tool. So I'd highly recommend you check out that video. You might even want to pause this one and go watch that, and then come back. I'll do my best, though, to give you the simplified version. So basically, with the NoiseXterminator, just like with dynamic background extraction, it would help to actually see more contrast in the photo. And that's what I'll do. I'll grab the screen transfer function tool and just bring my two lines closer together to add way more contrast to make the grain even more visible. And if you think about it, I'm going to be doing a lot more contrast adjustments in just a few minutes in Photoshop. And this will give us a good approximation of how things would look in, let's say, 10 minutes in terms of the contrast. So I might as well have it really boosted up now to get the best results out of NoiseXterminator. If you want to keep things simple, you can use denoise and iterations with the real-time preview. And hopefully this will come across in the video. I know with YouTube, they tend to downsample everything to like 480p, and it's hard to really see what's going on. So you might want to watch this on a computer or manually change the streaming resolution to be a bit higher. But even myself, I'm going to have trouble seeing this. All right, so again, basically what I was saying is if you want to keep this whole new process simple, just increase the denoise amount with your real-time preview until it looks good. You can also mess around with the iterations and see how that goes. One of the main problems you'll face, though, is that in PixInsight's preview, it's limited to 16 bits, not the 24 bits. And even if you turn that on, it's not going to do anything, unfortunately. So you might see some posterization that's normal. Unfortunately, that is going to limit our ability to see what's going on. To get the most out of NoiseXterminator, though, I recommend you turn on the two checkboxes, and that gives you complete control. So the way this works is we have high frequency noise and low frequency noise. High frequency noise, that's just all the grain you're accustomed to seeing. And so if you increase HF, high frequency, that's going to eliminate all that really grainy looking stuff. Low frequency noise, this is actually a big problem with this data. It's just these ugly, splotchy artifacts left behind. And because the background is so smooth, it really starts to become a problem, the low frequency noise. And it's up to you to find this combination where both of these work in tandem to eliminate a lot of the structural problems in your photos. And when you're doing these two changes, you can also mess around with the scale factor in pixels, moving it either up or down and seeing what changes. If you're really struggling to see a change, you might want to back out to the full preview and then select another part of the photo. Because I know up in here is pretty problematic. Again, the fact that we have the posterization is really not helping. But what I can do is play around with the scale until it seems to smooth things out. I know I'm not doing the best job of explaining this, but that's why I'd recommend you check out Adam Block's interview with Russell Croman for more information. Another thing we can do, besides just the denoise amount, is the color noise. This is something I've really been looking forward to for a while because in the past, the best way to get rid of color noise was actually in Camera Raw, which is a filter for Photoshop. There's a color noise reduction slider. And the way this one works is if we lower the color noise, you can see all these color models and splotches throughout the photo. That's a very annoying problem. Well, now it's no longer an issue, thanks to NoiseXterminator AI version 3. And you might have trouble seeing that just due to YouTube compression, but there is a big difference with the low frequency color noise. And of course, the high frequency color noise, that's all the rainbow colored specks everywhere. We'll also want to turn that pretty high. I guess the final bit of advice when you're trying to figure all this out is to remember that you don't want your background to be too smooth. If you max everything out, it's just gonna look kind of fake because it's gonna look almost like an oil painting. So I'd rather have a little bit of texture in terms of noise rather than completely getting rid of all that noise. All right, I think we've done as much as we can with this ugly 16-bit preview, so let's just give this a try and see how it looks. When this completes, you'll want to make sure you turn on a 24-bit preview. That will clear up the posterization, and let's see what we can decide about this. If we do before and after, wow, okay. So there was a lot of that really sharp, defined noise. Now, it's all gone. If I move over to another portion of the image, I want you to look right here. And as I do the before and after, we're almost adding detail that was covered up. That would probably be due to the AI kind of interpreting what it thought was there. I think it looks fine in this case, but that would be one thing to watch, is that it's not potentially adding things that maybe shouldn't be there. But really the way I think about this is imagine you have a nice photo with a bunch of sand or something all over it. And if you blow off that sand, you're revealing what's underneath, because this noise is very gritty looking. And earlier I mentioned that there's some galaxies in the photo. You can see those right now. That might be another area to focus on because we don't want to lose all the fine detail in there. Not that there's much to begin with, but I think it did a really nice job. Things are looking pretty good, but I am noticing some problems. We have a bright glow down here, which needs to be removed. We have the satellite trail, and we have another glow up here, which is a bit distracting. I'm also seeing a bit of maybe some green here in the shadows. It's hard to see because I have a bright window in my face, which is not smart for editing. But if I run SCNR, let's see what that does. I think that was actually a smart choice, running SCNR, because the last thing I want is little bits of green, which might look unnatural as we progress through the workflow. If we think back to just a few minutes ago, my screen transfer function was heavily altered to add contrast, but I like the way it looks. So I am going to stick with this. It'll just save me some time when we get to Photoshop. Therefore, I think we're just about done with the boring part of the workflow, as I call it. We fixed all the problems with the data as best we can, apart from some of the blemishes. Now we're going to head to Photoshop and have some fun with it. For that, I'll stretch my photos with the screen transfer function and the histogram. And I want to make sure I don't forget about my stars either. I'll stretch those right now. And we'll come back and get them at the end of the workflow. Next, I'll save this as a 16-bit TIFF, and we'll pick back up over in Photoshop. With your image loaded into Photoshop, I recommend you look things over right now and confirm that NoiseXterminator did a good job, because this is a much easier preview to use than PixInsight. If things look a bit unnatural or there's just something odd about it, then you might want to just pause, go back to PixInsight, undo NoiseXterminator, and try some different values and see if that looks better. I will say I think I pushed NoiseXterminator a bit farther than I normally would, but this is my first time using the version 3.0 of the AI, so we're learning together. Assuming that things look good, the next step is to duplicate our background layer. I'm going to call this cleanup. because since we have this really nice contrasty photo right out of the gate, that makes it easy to find any splotches or satellites and remove them. If you did not stretch your image this far though, then the first thing I would do is a curves adjustment layer. And with the curves adjustment layer, you can use the hand tool, click and drag down to make certain areas darker, click and drag up to make that brighter, and add contrast that way. Again, you might want to intentionally overdo it to see problems with the data. The more we stretch this though, I have to say I'm really blown away by all the cool stuff here in the image. We have these H-alpha clouds, we have just visible dust reflecting the light from Rigel, and a lot more. Not to mention all the little galaxies dotted throughout the photo. And that's why I really like to capture 20 and ideally 40 hours of data on all my targets these days. Because once you get that kind of exposure time, this detail stands out much better, and you can push the image further once you get to Photoshop. The less exposure time you have, the worse things will look as you add more contrast. I'm gonna leave this temporary now though, just to help with the cleanup. And there's a couple different ways you can handle this. You can try the patch tool, remove tool, or spot healing brush. And with the spot healing brush, you actually have 3 different choices: content aware fill, heal with texture, and then heal with proximity match. Based on my results, I think content aware or proximity match works best for this kind of thing. Provided you have the cleanup layer selected, we can use the spot healing brush tool, and we'll see about removing this satellite. To draw a straight line, you'll click once, hold down the shift key, and click again. In this case though, that did not do a good job, so let's try that again, just freehand. It's not looking good either. If the proximity match isn't working, then try content aware. Also, I found that it helps to do this in small little chunks. Do a little bit here, do a little bit there, rather than doing the straight line method. Sometimes that will look worse. The trouble is though, when you do this, you have to make sure it actually looks better afterwards. Sometimes it can actually really screw things up. But if you just keep doing this in little tiny segments, that normally does the best job. Next, I'll do my before and after. And it's certainly improved. It's not great though. So ideally, I would actually go back to the very beginning and restack the photo and try to get this stuff removed right at the start, because now we're just being destructive when we're trying to move these satellite trails. I think that'll work though. It's gotten rid of that really obvious straight line. Now everything just kind of blends together. Then we'll come up over here. I'll start at the top and work my way down. And part of the problem I have is that these are geostationary satellites, and there's so many of them just constantly going through the photo that it almost seems to add structure to the data. And both the stacking software and, in this case, Photoshop, thinks it's part of the image. So that makes it even more difficult to remove these straight lines through your photo, because it actually starts to look like nebulosity. But if we do before and after, I think you'll agree that is much better than it was before. Now we have the challenge of these bright halos around the stars. For this, I like to using the patch tool. That's at least a good starting point. With the patch tool, I can try to find the outer edge of it, draw a circle around it. Then from here, you click inside the circle, find a nearby area that matches if possible, and then let go. When that's complete, hit Control or Command D to deselect. And if you toggle the layer visibility, you can decide if it looks good or not. In my case, it's not bad, but there's this really defined edge because I was being lazy. So I could try this again. And then for my selection, I'll just blur this out slightly. So I'll do Select, Modify Feather, maybe just like 3 pixels. And now with the patch tool, make sure the layer is turned on. I can move this over. I have kind of invented some details by doing that. You know, none of that stuff was ever there before. But at the end of the day, I'm not too worried about it. I just want to get rid of that really obvious glare that's going to distract from the rest of the photo. From back here, it is a noticeable improvement. Another issue I had was these bright flares up over here. I'll do the same thing. Use the patch tool, find somewhere nearby, and yeah, it's better. I don't like that I'm adding stuff that shouldn't be there though, so I'll try to do my best to avoid that. Looks good enough for me. Finally, I am seeing these weird vertical bright areas that very well could be part of the image, but something about it just looks fake to me. The fact that it's almost like in a straight line all the way down here and there. So whether it's real or not, it looks artificial in the image, and that's a problem. So what I could try doing is burning this out. Probably go with just 3% opacity, very subtle. I might even want to do this as another layer. Assuming that all that stuff looks good, I'll duplicate the layer, and I'll call this burn. I know I'm being destructive with my editing, but it's good enough for me. And with this burn tool, again, you can affect the shadows, midtones, or highlights depending on what you're trying to make darker. I'll start with shadows. That's going to go really fast at 3%. And we'll just start painting over this area to make it blend in better. So if we do it before and after, see how bright that was, especially near the corner, it didn't look right. Now, nobody would ever even think to look over there. It just naturally fades away. And I can clean up any other odd vertical lines that shouldn't be there. You want to get in the habit, though, whenever you're doing burning, to do the before and after and really make sure you're not overdoing it, because that is easy to do. And you might make it way too dark, like I just did there. And if the shadows is not working for you, try midtones instead. That might target that area a bit better. I think we've come a long way in a short amount of time, so let me save this. And if I show you the before and after went from that, which is really messy, there's a lot going on, to that, much better. And I can also turn off this curve layer. That was just temporary. We're back to our default contrast. And I think you'll agree with me, it is kind of flat and boring at this point. So the next step is actually to add a curves layer. I know we just deleted one, but I'm going to do a new one this time. Make things a bit darker. And then make things a bit brighter there. From here, I'll do a selective color. Because we have this nice H-alpha throughout the photo, but because I was not using a filter and I had a color camera, it's pretty subdued. But with a selective color, targeting the red color channel, I can make it stand out a bit better. I can also alter the color balance of the red. I can make it more magenta if I want to. Whatever fits with the mood of the image that you're going for. Then I can try maybe the blue color channel and increase that. This is all entirely up to your own personal taste, whatever you think looks good. One thing I try to stress though in my lessons and in my course is that when you're doing selective color, it's best to do this gradually, one layer at a time. With that said, I've done one selective color layer. I'll add a second selective color layer, and I'll go back through another time. This allows me to really bring out the reds or whatever else I'm trying to adjust in the photo. Maybe this time I'll target the magentas as well. Now we're having a nice impact on that background. And I might even do one more selective color. This time though, let's try the neutrals color channel. Because with neutrals, we can really radically alter the mood of the photo. And I've got an idea. We'll see how it goes. But the idea is to make this a bit more red and magenta, only in the shadows though. I don't want this interfering necessarily with the rest of the image balance. For that, I'll use a tool called Instamask. This is part of Raya Pro. I talk a lot about this in the Deep Space course, but basically with Instamask, you can very easily make luminosity masks or color masks. In this case, I'm mainly interested, I guess, in the shadows or even kind of the red color in the image. Therefore, I'll use the luminosity button and I'll try, let's say, dark 6. You might be very confused right now if you're not familiar with layer masks, but basically everything white will be selected by our selective color layer. Anything black will not be targeted. And I can use the shadows, midtones, and highlight sliders in Instamask to further refine this. So the brighter the white it is, the more it will target that area. I realize if you're watching this, you might be very confused right now. This takes a while to wrap your mind around it. And if you want to learn more, I'd recommend checking out Jimmy McIntyre. He's the guy that made this software, and he goes through and explains it a lot in his YouTube videos. When we think we have the mask though, we'll click on select. Things go really crazy though. And then I'm going to delete the layer mask for selective color layer 3. If I just add a new one, it is now pasted that layer mask into the Selective Color layer 3. And if I do the before and after, it is a bit subtle, I'll say that, but you can hopefully see how we're just getting a bit more red in the shadows. Looks good. With my layer mask in place, I can continue to adjust the sliders for the neutral color channel to make this whatever I want it to be, now that we actually have the mask figured out. That is subtle, but I think it really takes the image to another level. And if we do the 3 selective colors, it's night and day. We've really brought out the H alpha that was kind of just hidden away in the background. And I could even do, let's say, one more selective color layer. This time though, I'm going to target the brightest parts of the photo. So I'll do B1 for brights 1. This is essentially the inverse of what we've done, so only basically the witch's head and then this glare will be targeted. Then I'll hit select. I'll delete the layer mask and add a new one. I don't know what happened there, but there we go. So now I have my layer mask for Selective Color layer 4, and everything I do should only target, as you can see, the brighter parts of the photo. So if I want the witch's head to be maybe a bit more neutral, not too blue, I can do that. Or I know there is a lot of blue in that, so I could try changing it to blue or cyan and play around with that. I realize this is all very subtle, so you might have a hard time seeing what I'm doing, but in any event, we've just done a slight color change to the witch's head. From here, I'm going to be a bit destructive again, assuming that everything looks good. So with that in mind, you might want to save things, go get a glass of water, come back, look things over carefully, toggle off the layers and make sure nothing went too far. If you confirm things look good and you don't mind being destructive, we'll hit Control-Shift-Alt-E or Command-Shift-Option-E if you're on a Mac. If you did that right, you'll have a new layer on top of everything else. This is a composite layer, and we can move on with the workflow. If this happens to you and everything just goes flat, that's because you did not get the right key combination. You want to try that again. Control-Shift-Alt-E, Command-Shift-Option-E. From here, we'll go up to Filter, Camera Raw Filter, and you can use this at any point in the workflow actually on a composite layer. It might be easier if you're struggling with curves or anything else. You can very quickly adjust the contrast of the photo, the colors, and whatever else you think needs fixed. Moving down, we have Texture and Clarity. I like to play around with these quite a bit because they really can enhance the nebulosity in your photo, but you have to be careful. And in fact, for this workflow, I want you to leave these both at 0 for right now. We'll come back and do this in a second pass. Because we used NoiseXterminator version 3.0 today, there's really not much color noise. Normally there would be. So that is one nice improvement of the new software update. But if you still see a lot of color noise throughout the photo, then come down to the Detail tab and increase the color noise reduction slider. I wouldn't go more than about 10 though, because the further you go, the more of the color you actually lose. This is all about just cleaning up things at a pixel level. Assuming things look halfway decent, we'll hit OK. I'm going to rename this layer to Camera Raw, and we'll call it, I guess, Contrast. That's the main thing we did. Then I'll create another composite layer. This one we'll rename to Camera Raw Texture. With the texture layer created, we'll go right back up to the Camera Raw filter. And now the only thing I'm interested in is under the Effects tab. As I increase that texture, it really adds a lot to the photo. Probably too much, in fact. So it's all about finding that sweet spot where you add detail, but it doesn't look too strange. You can also play around with the clarity slider, but be careful. This one can really mess things up quickly. Don't touch dehaze, vignette, or anything else. And if things look good, we'll hit OK. Now the nice thing with Photoshop is that we have the ability to lower the opacity of any layer. And that's very often what I'll do is I'll intentionally overdo it with the texture. Then I'll come back in here where I can get a close-up look on everything. And I'll start to lower the opacity of the layer to something a bit more subtle, maybe just like 40 or 50%. I have to say, this turned out fairly good. I mean, there are still some problems, like we have a splotch there I should have caught. And the issue is if I try to fix this now, I'm doing it on a Camera Raw texture layer with an opacity of 48%, meaning it's not going to do much. We also have kind of a weird remnant from StarXterminator there. So in this case, I'm going to do a final cleanup layer by hitting Control-Shift-Alt-E, and then I'll clean up those remaining problems. That's the thing, if you do this at the end, you'll probably see some things that you weren't able to see before because we hadn't pushed things quite as far. From here, I'd recommend you go take another breather, come back, make sure things look good, and then we're going to save a copy. File, save a copy. The reason we're doing save a copy in particular is because we need to turn off alpha channels and layers. Both of these will cause problems in PixInsight. The file name, I'll call this version 1 final, even though it's still not technically final. And I'll save that with the sRGB color profile embedded. Then we'll hop right back into PixInsight and finish up with the video. Before we finish this workflow, I wanted to mention I am teaching a few workshops this year. I've got 2 this summer from Eastern Idaho, and then I'm doing back-to-back workshops down in South America, near the Atacama Desert. Spaces are limited though, so if you're interested, I recommend you head over to my website, check out all the details, and then shoot me an email if you'd like to join us. We've now got our 2 images side by side. I think you'll agree with me that the image on the left is much more appealing. The color balance is much more interesting. Most of the splotches and remnants and everything else have been removed, and the contrast looks quite a bit nicer. The final step is to blend in our stars, and the best way of doing that is with ImageBlend. I used to use pixel math and all that other stuff, but this is now a much simpler and streamlined approach to that process. The way it works, if you're not familiar with it, you have a base image and a blend image. The base image is going to be your final starless photo. The blend image will be your stars photo, assuming that you stretch them. If you forgot to stretch them, things are going to look very strange, as they do right now. Although my problem is not that they weren't stretched, my problem is the filter type and the blend mode. Make sure the filter type is set to none and the blend mode is set to screen. This gets you the effect that you're going for. And the best part about this tool is that we can do a star reduction with the midtone slider. As you move the midtone slider to the right, the stars get dimmer. Just move them as far as you want until things look good. Don't go too far though, because then the image starts to look kind of strange, although that's up to you to determine what looks good and what doesn't. I'll go with a value of around 85. That's usually a good starting point for me. And if you can't see the green checkmark button, just minimize one of these tabs, and now it should be visible. There we go. And if we take a look, we'll get this full screen here. I gotta say, I am pretty impressed how this turned out, especially considering I was doing this live. Normally when you're doing these live edits, they don't turn out as good as it does when you're on your own just having fun. I guess my final word today is that if you are looking for a fun winter target, the Witch's Head is a great choice. Although you will want to shoot this from a dark sky because it is very prone to light pollution. And in terms of your exposure time, I'd recommend at least 12 hours, if not 20 or more. Finally, because there are a lot of those geostationary satellites going through the image, you might want to play around with your stacking settings a bit more to try to minimize those as much as possible. If you enjoyed the video, then you'll want to check out my Deep Space course. There's over 80 videos just like this that go through the setup process, how to purchase better gear, using your ASIR, and of course, post-processing. Don't forget, I also have some workshops if you'd like to join me this summer. We'll be shooting from a Bortle 2, just like you see here, and that'll give us a great opportunity to capture some amazing data. That's all I've got for you today though. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in another video.